Welcome to the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites Dialogues event. My name is Randy Mason. I'm a professor in the graduate program in historic preservation and the faculty director of the center. And I'm delighted that we have a wonderful guest tonight to talk about her work, Dr. Tiffany Momon, who is an assistant professor at Sewanee, the University of the South. And has been working or is continuing to work on a number of really fascinating historic preservation, public history, material culture projects that we'll have the better part of an hour to hear about tonight. Let me just give a really quick introduction and lay some ground rules, and then we'll dig into the conversation. So Dr. Momon has a number of degrees from a number of universities, but I think most notably to her work as a professor, a PhD from Middle Tennessee State University, and it's very highly regarded public history and historic preservation program. I think especially in the Southeast, it's really the top of the hill when it comes to historic preservation and public history. And she has been working on a number of projects over her career in the Southeast, and about which we'll hear a few tonight. I think the reason that we first got connected to Dr. Momon was because of a project that continues to grow, the Black Craftspeople.org website and digital humanities project, which I'm really excited to hear more about later on. And so with that, I will welcome you officially, I guess, Dr. Momon, and ask you to just say hello to our assembled participants tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Randy, for the invitation. I'm glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to this.
Great. Just one quick word about the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites here at the Weitzman School of Design. Our mission has to do with broadly supporting and increasing the capacity of organizations working within the space of Black heritage and civil rights histories to preserve and sustain sites of significance to those really important and vastly overlooked and often erased stories and narratives. As part of that, we are very fortunate to have a partnership with Tuskegee University, which has taught us a lot, and including taught us a lot about the Alabama Black Belt. Of course, everything that we think that we know shows us something that we don't know. So we're really grateful to have another professional and scholar very familiar with Alabama and the Southeast to talk about her work. So just to start us off, sorry, before I do that, I always forget. For those of you who are watching at home or in your office, Tiffany and I will talk for 40 or 45 minutes or so, just informally back and forth. And then we'll have time to hear and respond to whatever questions or comments you all have. So during the talk, please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A tab on Zoom, and those will accumulate, and we'll get to those once we're finished the first part of the conversation. So with that preliminary, Tiffany, I just wanted to ask you to, first of all, to talk a little bit about your path through the fields of preservation and public history and to your current work at Sewanee, and just kind of how you found yourself on that path, which I think a lot of students would find inspiration in.
Sure. So I graduated from undergrad with a degree in political science and international relations from Tennessee State University, an HBCU in Nashville, Tennessee. And I went off and I worked for a professional services firm for about 7 years. But it was during that time that it only took me didn't even take me that long, honestly, to realize that I didn't like the work that I was doing. So I ended up there about 5 years into working there, going back to school. And what spurred me going back to school was that I had begun to do my family's genealogy. So on days when I was at work and didn't really want to be at work, I would find myself doing genealogy and all over ancestry.com and family search instead of, doing my actual work. But from that, I began to quickly realize that I've been able to trace down these people. It really helped in terms of preparing me for graduate school, just that hunt for sources and knowing where to find sources and how to find them. And then I quickly realized that, oh, this is great. I know where they are. I know what states they're in. But I quickly began to realize that it would be really interesting to put them into the context of American history. So I went back to the University of Memphis. I decided that, I just sort of do this little side thing. And I got another degree in African and African American studies to sort of add what I could to my family's story. And then from there, I decided one day at work that, you know what, I'm just going to apply for graduate school. And I sort of did it on a whim, basically. Didn't apply for any financial aid, didn't apply for a graduate assistantship. And I was sitting in my cubicle one day and I got a call from the history department at MTSU. And they said, we saw you applied, but you didn't ask us for any money, but we want to give you some money to attend. And so I said, great. And 2 weeks later, I left my job. And that fall, I started at graduate school at MTSU. So it wasn't planned. It just sort of happened that way for the best. And while I was there pursuing my MA at MTSU, I decided that I wanted to focus on historical archaeology. And I did that for my master's degree. And while I was there for my master's degree, I ended up sort of hanging out at the Center for Historic Preservation. I didn't have a graduate assistantship through them, but one of my friends did. And honestly, I would just go and sit with her at the center. And it just so happened that the director of the center, Dr. Carol Van West, kept seeing me there. And one of those summers, he offered me an opportunity to come work for the center during the summer to see how I would like it. So I did that, fell in love with historic preservation, loved the connections between historical archaeology and historic preservation. And when I went back for my PhD, I decided to stay at MTSU, work for the Center for Historic Preservation, and make that my focus.
That's I really appreciate hearing that. It seems like so many of us in the preservation field, as many people are in the field, there are as many stories about how we find ourselves or find our way to the field. And a lot of those stories, I think, seem to start with either with family, genealogy or stories, or a parent or grandparent that inspires us, or a place. That a place where one feels rooted, or is important in family memory, and or the combination of the two, family and the kind of richness of place. So I think it's fascinating to hear your version of it. I think we all have a kind of a different version of how we personally kind of have attachments that draw us into this field. And it's not a field that a lot of people know about and sort of get drawn toward. It's more a matter of kind of backing into it more often than not. So that's more of my story. So I feel like I'm in good company if that was your story as well. And kudos to Dr. Van West for being in the right place at the right time to offer you that assistantship.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and your upbringing in your family, are you from the South? And did you grow up in the landscapes that you ended up studying as a graduate student and a professor?
Yes. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and Memphis is one of those cities. I tell people you can just feel the soul bubbling up out of the ground. It is such a wonderful city. And it just so happened that the Center for Historic Preservation, when I joined, had so many historic preservation projects in Memphis. So it was great to be able to go back to Memphis and look at it through that lens. And it just so happened that one of my very first projects that I worked on as a graduate student was with the historic Orange Mound community in Memphis, and that's actually where I grew up. So it was very interesting to be able to go back and and look at it, from a preservation perspective. And as we're sort of doing our boots on the ground work and walking the neighborhoods, I'm like, oh, I know that place. I know that place. This is where I went to preschool. So, all of those sorts of things were very interesting. But my family is originally from Mississippi and Alabama, that Mississippi-Alabama border. And I tell people, interestingly enough, my parents, my great grandparents on both sides of my family, from what I can tell, in 1870, they were about 20 miles from each other. But it took, generations and my parents meeting at a disco in Memphis to make that connection there. But yeah, that's one of the things that I love about this work is that, being from the South, being from these areas, and having the opportunity to go back and do preservation work that's meaningful, that's significant, that brings about community change is such a delight.
Yeah. So could I ask you to talk about some of those projects, not necessarily chronologically from start to finish, but just the preservation projects and the community facing projects that have meant the most to you?
Oh, wow. So one of the, let me think for a second. One of my favorite preservation projects happened when I was a graduate student, and we were looking at a church in Athens, Tennessee, and it was a building for an African American church. It was no longer in use. It was down a little dirt road, and across the street was a cemetery. And I was the only person of color on that particular trip. And so we went out to the church and we did our usual thing of meeting the community, having a meeting at the start, listening. I can't emphasize listening to what the community wants enough. And then we went about taking our, measured drawings and photographs and all of those sorts of things. And just the way that I work, I happen to go outside. And of course, I'm looking at the exterior of the building. I'm looking at the building strip lines. I'm looking for, what little bits of material culture have sort of settled around the building. And then I go across the street to the cemetery. And an African-American woman from the group follows me across the street, and we're both sort of just walking, and I'm just looking at the grave markers, and I stop at one. And then she comes over to me and she asks me if I like it. And I'm like, I absolutely love this marker. It was a marker in concrete. You could tell that the name and date and all of that info was just sort of handwritten into the wet concrete. And she was like, oh, I'm so glad that you like it. And she goes, because I made it. And then she tells me this entire story about how her father would make these markers for members in the community, but he couldn't read or write. And so he would have he'd make the shape, and she would come over and put the names and the dates into the markers. And to me, those are those kinds of stories that you don't find in a history book, that you actually have to go out into the community, do that boots on the ground work to come across. And what I really appreciated was that she felt comfortable enough with me to tell me that story, because she admitted, she was like, I didn't want to tell everybody else, but she was like, but I'll tell you what happened. And so I get this great, community story. And as I looked around the cemetery, I could see all of the other markers that her father had shaped and that she had written on. So
that's really powerful. And hopefully I'm not over-interpreting, but I'm beginning to see where the Black craftspeople idea begins, is there a long time ago, and to understand the act of making something, not just the kind of artifact that we find, is even more a stronger human connection yet. So are there other projects that I feel like that's an amazing one? Are there other projects that have been important to along your path?
The projects that I really like are, so we did a lot of work with Rosenwald schools. And the projects that I really like, now that I sit back and think about it, are those where it's really the community coming together and saying, we have a building, tell us what to do. Can you help us figure out a way to make this building relevant? And it's something about going into those old Rosenwald schools looking at the windows, of course, which, Rosenwald schools are well known for, walking those floors, looking at the layout, and listening to people tell stories about when they went there. That has probably been one of the highlights of my career. Just the way that preservation brings people together to tell these stories, to document these stories in places, and to make sure that we can get the word out. There was a community group in Loudon, Tennessee, which is in East Tennessee, that was working to save their Rosenwald school. And further along in that school's history, sort of like a basement room was added, concrete block sort of a room, because the county was attempting to make that school an equalization school rather than integrate. But there was just something so moving about the way that the community had come together, put their resources together, were attempting to find any experts or knowledgeable people in the field to save that building that I'll always remember. And even here in Sewanee, so the interesting thing about the historic preservation projects here in Sewanee is that the African-American community's original institutions no longer stand. And so the question posed was, well, how do we acknowledge these plots of land without the buildings? And so I was very glad to step in to say, we can actually do that. Mm-hmm. But what makes Sewanee's story so interesting in terms of historic preservation for me is that it's a story where the African-American community was so intimately tied to the success of the university, that they were workers at the university and all of these sorts of things, but they were never really acknowledged. They were always sort of pushed to the side. The African-American community here up until the 1950s was dirt roads, no plumbing, no lighting. You can go back and read issues of the university's newspaper where other students are warning students, well, no, you don't want to go to that side of town at night because it's pitch black over there. You can't see anything and all of that sort of thing. But what ends up happening is the story is so much larger. There is a well-established African-American community over there with a school, a church, a social club. What I found by looking at old editions of the Nashville Globe, which was a Black newspaper based out of Nashville, Tennessee, is that there's this whole social world over there that nobody at this university had ever bothered to document. And so you've got details of their comings and goings and how they're interacting with other African-American communities in this part of Tennessee. And so it was, I could not wait to share that story with folks here, just to be like, you may not see their institutions now because they're gone, but they were here. So that's been very, very rewarding work.
Has that been a project that the university is supporting you taking up, or is it something the university was already working on, or are you still trying to convince?
No, it's a little bit of both. So I actually, just being an inquisitive student, I was looking for because this started when I was a graduate student. I was looking for universities near me that were part of the University Studying Slavery Consortium. Mm-hmm. And then I found Sewanee. And so I just sent a cold email to someone I'd never met and said, hey, I found all of this stuff about the Black community in Sewanee. Can I come up there and can we talk about it? And so, yeah, that's what happened. And then I later graduated and needed, to find a job, went on the job market. And that same professor emailed me and said, hey, apply for this. We've got an opening. So it just sort of happened that way. But in the time that's passed, the university has come to support that work through what is now known as the Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation. And it's a great part of our work. This summer, we launched a digital archive at blacksewanee.org. And you can see some of the photographs of the families that used to call this area home.
Fantastic, such important work. Congratulations on getting that off the ground. And it sounds like that there's plenty more work to be done with your students too, I expect.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So when we last talked, you also mentioned having worked at some HBCUs. in Alabama, if I recall, and being an HBCU grad yourself, can you reflect a little bit on your work on HBCUs and the role that you think that they should play going forward in growing the kind of capacity and interest in preservation among Black students?
Absolutely. So I stumbled into that HBCU work writing my master's thesis. I wrote it on Knoxville College, which is an HBCU in Knoxville, Tennessee, and they had just closed. They opened about 1876, and when I was writing my thesis, the announcement came out that the university was closing. It just so happened that my father and my aunt were graduates of Knoxville College. So I'd been there before as a child, but there was something that sort of stuck with me in this idea that what happens when a university closes? So what happens to its buildings, its spaces, its archives, all of those sorts of things. And so Knoxville College was already on the National Register at the time, but it was a joy to go back and do more research on that university and to tell more stories, just looking at the entire cultural landscape of what was there before the university was and to what was there now. And so as a graduate student, I stumbled across this opportunity with the state of Alabama, to add 8 of the state's colleges, HBCUs, to the National Register. So we were either adding HBCUs that weren't on the register to the National Register, or we were doing boundary increase nominations for those 8 universities that were already on the register. And over the course of that project, we successfully added 2 of those universities. But what was so interesting about that work was, so it was a full-scale, had to write the nominations, but I also had to survey the campuses. So survey photographs and survey forms and all of those sorts of things. And I learned a lot because, coming in as sort of a green student, you're like, oh, I want to save everything. I must save everything. They can't change anything. But sort of hearing some of the concerns from administrators at those universities and how they, needed newer buildings and facilities to attract students, you sort of begin to think, wow, or is there a way to, do historic preservation on these campuses in a way that's respectful to the past, but also acknowledges that these places are living places, that they must have a future. So out of that work came a nomination for Stillman College, which is in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, not too far from the University of Alabama. And Stillman's a beautiful campus. And what stuck out to me about Stillman was that campus had formerly been a plantation. And so when the college moved there, because they were originally in like a neighborhood home, and when they finally moved to what would become the campus, they held classes in that former plantation mansion. They held classes in there. Students lived on the upper floors. And they grew the campus from there. And so that building no longer stands. But what happens is that building deteriorated. A tornado happened, and so they needed to demolish it. But they kept the original columns and capitals. And when they rebuilt that building, they built it almost exactly, almost back to exactly what it was. But this time it was going to be a library. So they have a building that it's not the mansion that was originally there, but it's a replica. And there's something about that stuck out to me, that these individuals who founded this college were able to take a place where so many bad things happen, a place of strife, and turn it into this educational landscape, utilizing the building that was already there to educate people, when we know that building that was there had been a symbol of their oppression. And to continue to look at that building as to the replica of it as a campus landmark. There's just something I enjoy about that story, and transforming that space into what they needed it to be. And so that work also led me to Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama, which is probably one of my favorite HBCU campuses, because it has an amazing landscape of early 20th century faculty cottages all lined up on a tree-lined street. It's really amazing. But in telling that Talladega story, I was reminded of the importance of working with these institutions on other preservation projects. So it quickly became not just, oh, a National Register nomination, update to their existing nomination, but it quickly became they needed funding to save the roof of the historic Savory Library there on campus. And so we worked to write a historic structures report for them. And so it was one of those things where building these relationships aided and turned into something so much bigger than I originally thought it would be. And that project also took me down to Selma, Alabama, where I surveyed the campus of Selma University. I also surveyed the campus of Concordia College at Selma, which unfortunately was closing at the time. So that was quite the challenge in trying to figure out a way to do this preservation work, but also be respectful of a very challenging time that they were going through. And in addition, we surveyed Alabama A&M, we surveyed Alabama State University, and it was just interesting thinking about the ways that college campuses develop, thinking about those early educators, those early students. And yeah, it was my sort of first time leading a project of that scale. And I learned a lot.
Well, it sounds like you covered a lot of ground, as literally and figuratively as well, with these colleges. I would love to, no pressure, but I would love to hear that you're working on a book on that someday. That's, I think, bringing, extending the life of those landscapes, even though some of the colleges obviously have, as you mentioned, have closed. Others are, managed to go on. And I think it remains a really significant challenge, even for the HBCU campuses. This goes for other colleges as well, that are quite intact, that have really sort of clear senses of their own history. It's still difficult for administrators and people who are the capital projects folks to bring themselves to understand preservation as a viable option when it comes to satisfying what they feel like an urgent need for, let's say, a new gym or a better stadium or more parking. To be able to assert historic preservation logics in those situations is, I've heard from many colleagues, and now including your voice among them, just a really acute need with these smaller HBCUs as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think too, part of that work and thinking about, how we continue to do that work, how we continue to train practitioners, is making sure that universities such as those have those historic preservation programs, right? Because what we know about the existing National Register is that out of, 95,000 or so sites, about 2% of those tell African-American stories, right? And so it's part of that work going forward needs to be training people who understand that work, who understand African-American landscapes and the complexities that come with studying those, who understand that context of history to aid us in making sure that those sites get added.
Amen. So when your students say they want to go to graduate school to double down on their historic preservation training, you can point them to Philadelphia if they want to come north. So the National Register obviously is a center point in lots of different kinds of preservation work, as you've pointed out in your own career. It's also it's become, particularly in the last number of years when the National Park Service civil rights funding has been robust, an important gateway to some really substantial funds, especially for small sites. So it's really kind of ensconced as an important part of our practice. Yet there are lots of the kind of practices around the National Register or around the other codified ways of thinking about preservation, the rehab tax credits, and so on. They also present barriers, and the kind of conceptual apparatus present barriers. to recognizing maybe other forms of heritage that are not maybe as clearly architecturally expressed. And these are particularly important, as many scholars have written about the Black experience. And I just wonder if you would reflect on that for a minute about if you could begin that process of rewriting the National Register, or reconceptualizing preservation policies, where would you begin?
There is nothing more frustrating than working with a community group and they come back and tell you, well, we were denied. We were told that we weren't eligible for the National Register because we did X, Y, and Z to save the building. So there was an instance here in Tennessee where a church put a metal roof on a building because they needed to keep the water out, and they got a good deal on it. And then, the preservationists in charge of that came back and said, well, you added that metal roof and that's not historically accurate, and so on and so forth. So that makes you ineligible. When I'm looking at the situation and I'm like, well, you have a community who did what needed to be done, because if it kept raining in the building, we wouldn't have a building, right? And so when I think about situations like that, I don't think that the National Register, as written and as executed, does enough to address situations like that. It's too heavy on architectural styles and things like that to address the needs of communities who were building spaces, building institutions with what they had, and who are attempting to save them with what they have now. And it really puts those communities at a disadvantage, right? So I think, there are much better ways to be able to serve those communities in a way that doesn't continue to do harm there. And oh boy, if I change the National Register, what would I do? I've already talked about sort of more training of people of color, Black preservationists, Indigenous preservationists. And I really think just making sure that the register, so it's written in 1966. I'm one of those people who's like, it could do for an update. But making sure that it is reflective of, that it has the capabilities to respond to the complexities of Black life. I always think about it in terms of, Black communities were often forced to buy marginalized lands that nobody else wanted. They get decimated during urban renewal, decimated during the construction of interstate highways. In Nashville, Tennessee, when I-40 comes through, it wipes out 600 homes and businesses in the North Nashville African-American community, right? And when you travel through North Nashville today, you can feel how that, you can't help but to see that giant overpass. That, I feel like that community in many ways is still trying to recover from what happened there all of those years ago. So I feel like the National Register needs to take into account those things. And to make sure that it's not furthering the oppression of those groups of people.
Absolutely. The integrity concept in particular seems like a particularly unthinking concept when it comes to that. The example that you mentioned of the church replacing its roof is such a powerful example. We're in the process this semester of working on doing a studio project in Montgomery, Alabama, where in Peacock Tract in the west side, where the highway is destroyed. I don't even know the number of dozens, hundreds of structures and livelihoods, and it really does seem like it's still, that process is still unfolding. It's not. It doesn't just stop when the highway begins. So I think the really long reach of those narratives of willful destruction by the authorities of these self-sufficient Black neighborhoods is another super important story to be told, and the tools that we need to do that repair are not waiting for us in the National Register, although that's part of the solution, of course. have got one eye on the clock, and I want to make sure to turn to your current and future work as well, before we run out of time. I'll also put in a plug for those of you listening to ask your questions now if you like. So at a different scale, we've been talking a lot about buildings and landscapes. Very comfortable to me because I'm more of a bigger scale. My interests are at a bigger scale. I was really fascinated to wormhole into your website, the blackcraftspeople.org website, to really appreciate another and more essentially human scale, I think, where these issues about Black heritage and the creation of communities and the creation of worlds is so powerfully represented in not just the artifacts, but the practices. And I think it's a wonderful path of using digital humanities that you're using digital humanities to try to recover and retell some of these stories. So maybe if you could just tell a little bit about like the power of the ideas as you see them, and where this project came from and where it's going.
Sure. So the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive was really born out of frustration. I fell in love with the decorative arts as a graduate student. I couldn't believe that, oh, you can actually, there's people who go back and who study, makers and who love furniture like I do. But what I quickly realized in sort of moving in some of those decorative arts circles, I took 2 summer courses with the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem. But what I quickly realized was that I didn't like the way that they talked about Black craftspeople or didn't talk about them at all. And so it was a constant battle of me going, well, no, these people are everywhere. They are everywhere. Like nothing's getting made, pre-Civil War without an African-American craftsperson being attached to it. And so what I did was I was working on a project for one of those courses, and I was looking at a gentleman named John Quash Williams, who had been born enslaved, worked to construct a house that was known as the Pinckney Mansion in Charleston, South Carolina. He finishes working on that house in 1750, and he places an advertisement in the South Carolina Gazette that he's a free man and he's looking for carpentry work. Hmm. And then so I went back to the Pinckney papers, and I began to realize, oh, here are all the other names of enslaved craftsmen who worked on that house. But the good fortune of the Pinckney papers were that they took great notes. The Pinckneys took excellent notes on what the people they enslaved were doing. So I was able to trace them across the Low Country. And then I quickly went, well, if I can do it for these 7 or 8 men here, who else can I do it for? And so that really helped sort of spur the idea of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive. It was wanting to talk about decorative arts and objects in a way where we talked about people, we talked about objects, and we talked about place all together. And so what was very important to me was to create that digital map that's part of the archive and connect those primary source records. Right now, our central primary source records are advertisements seeking the return of enslaved people. But it was important for me to connect those to place. And it worked so well with us starting out in South Carolina just because of the history there and everything that's been written about South Carolina and, pre-Civil War. And so it really just took off from there. I imagined that it was just going to sort of be my sleepy little side project that I'd work on. And we went viral. And then we went viral a second time. And then so I feel like since that point, it's been me sort of chasing behind the project to keep up with its explosive growth. But the idea there really is to acknowledge Black craftspeople and their contributions, their lives and their experiences, to tell stories of Black craftspeople in a very humanistic way, to address the shortcomings of the decorative arts field and to push the field further, because we know that they were there. I'm telling you, there's not a shortage of sources on skilled Black craftspeople. We just need to talk about them. We need to make sure that when we're making museum exhibitions that we add those stories to our object labels and things like that. And so right now we are live right now are South Carolina and Tennessee. But we just put the finishing touches on Virginia, which I'm very excited about. After Virginia, we have a Georgia collection as well that's waiting in the wings. We have a collection that's waiting on Jamaica. So we went to the Caribbean for that. And we had the good fortune of working with 2 graduate students this past summer to begin a collection in New York. I always thought that this would be sort of a Southern project, but then when I was presented with the opportunity to work with those students to tell a New York story, I had to jump on it. So it's been very exciting, and it's just what I love about the work is doing it in the digital humanities way. That archive sort of I tell people it came together by like the skin of my teeth. It was me watching YouTube videos and reading. Because it runs on Omeka, which is the content management platform. So it was watching videos on how to set up the archive, how I handle my sources. It was calling in favors from my archivist friends, from the GIS developer behind the map, because at the beginning of the project, it was very much self-funded. Me and my co-director were paying for everything out of our pockets. And it was just one of those things where it really felt like, for years I had thought it would be great if there was something like this that existed. And then one day it was like, you should just do it. And here I am.
You're making it sound a little bit too easy, but I can tell it also has been a ton of work. I'm just going to ask my colleague Sarah Lerner, who I know is listening, if you could put the URL and the Instagram feed in the chat so that everybody can make sure to go to it at some point. It's really a wonderfully rich digital environment. Look forward to seeing like who else discovers it and wants to help you add to it in the future. You mentioned a couple minutes ago that you've gone viral a few times. I wonder if you could like recount like why that happened and what it was that really kind of sparked the public's broader conversation, because you've got quite a lot of Instagram followers, I understand.
Yeah, so what ended up happening, we had about 450 followers on Instagram. And shortly after the murder of George Floyd, I wrote a statement just sort of recounting my own experiences as a child in Memphis. A terrible experience I had with a child and dealing with sort of some white supremacists that cornered me on a street in Memphis. And so I wrote the statement. I might have said something along the lines of, wanting to push the museum, the field forward and really not standing for any anti-Blackness in the museum and historic preservation worlds. And that statement went viral. And then I had previously helped a colleague write, I didn't help him write it. I actually just read over it and sort of edited for him an article that he was publishing on Confederate monuments and memorials. And so as a return favor, he made an Instagram post about Black historians you should follow. And that went viral. And so we went from at first like 400, 450 followers to 5,000 or so after my statement, all the way up to 19,500 from my friend who published that sort of Instagram infographic. But it was, I honestly feel like it was just meant to be. I was really excited that people actually felt that the work that we were doing was meaningful and that it could make a difference.
Absolutely, it's such important work, and it's meeting such an important moment. I'm glad to hear that you're breaking through to larger publics. I think it's one of the frustrations for many of us working in preservation or museums and dec arts that we don't have the public's eye or ear or mind enough of the time. And kudos to you for making sure that that doesn't stay the case for the foreseeable future. Have you gotten have some of the decorative arts world responded positively to your critiques, or has it been kind of have they been deaf to it? Not to draw too stark a contrast.
Yeah, we did. We got a lot of positive feedback, continue to still get positive feedback about the work that we're doing in the forms of, collaborations, collaborating in the future on exhibitions and things like that. We've also had quite a few naysayers who say that we are revisionist or something to that equivalent, that we're being ahistorical and all of these sorts of things. And one of my favorite things to say is, I don't argue with me, argue with the primary sources. because if these people were here, these are the stories that we are telling. We can back this up. Nothing here is new.
Well said. Confront the sources, confront the evidence. So I could ask you questions for a very long time. I did want to leave a few minutes for if there are other things that we didn't touch on that you'd like to elaborate on a little bit, other aspects of your work or what you're thinking about doing next or your teaching. Happy to kind of clear the space for you to do that for a few minutes, and then maybe we can have a few questions from our audience.
Sure. In terms of just teaching and what we're doing here at Sewanee, it's some of the work that we are doing is really turning and sort of looking inward and using what we know about Sewanee's troubled past, Sewanee's sort of forever, it feels like, entanglements with the Confederacy and the Old South and all of that, and looking for new ways to sort of combat that. I'm very excited about where we're going in that work as we, push back against the Sewanee of 20, maybe even 10 years ago. As we seek to tell, more inclusive stories, as we seek to engage with the communities that used to live here on the mountain. And a lot of that is, it's difficult to wade through, right? Because we have to continuously ask ourselves, at one point there were about 200 African-American families in the town of Sewanee, and now there are less than 20. So we have to, investigate why that is, understand the university's role in that erasure. And one of the ways that we're doing that, again, is through that community archiving work. And so we are, bringing that into the classroom as much as possible. I'll be teaching a course on community archiving in the spring, and just making sure that we train and teach this next generation of Sewanee students that, that old Sewanee is no more.
Yeah, and I think there's been quite a mixed experience of universities around the country embracing with purpose, or sometimes with reluctance, or sometimes not at all, with the entanglements, especially when the entanglements, quote unquote, are indirect or distant from the actual place itself, and whether it's about kind of investments and the financial history of the university. It's just as powerful a link, but it seems more elusive in terms of how to have it, how to use it to kind of change minds and open people's minds to understanding the history of the institution a little bit more differently and more critically.
Absolutely.
And ask the questions about how we're making decisions right now. For instance, I know in Philadelphia and at Penn, that's the relationship of the university to its immediate surroundings continues to be fraught, and but it's neither a new issue nor just an old issue. It's just really kind of part of our history, and for the foreseeable past and the foreseeable future.
Right.
Well, listen, I could ask questions for a long time, but I will yield to some of our other colleagues who are either participating as attendees or have got questions in their back pocket otherwise. So please type those into the Q&A now, and we can spend just a few more minutes of Dr. Momon's time. You probably have more classes to prepare for tomorrow, and all the other work of the professor to do. Can I ask you, while we're waiting for any questions to come in, if you could envision a kind of an ideal next project to direct the Black Craftspeople work, the Black Craftspeople Digital Humanities project, what can you envision being a kind of a next level project or next generation project on that work? Would it be working with a museum and its collection? Would it be working with, I don't know, the city of Charleston or the Charleston, the heritage groups in Charleston, or how would you envision using it to make even greater impact?
So I have this idea, Randy, that's sort of been in the back of my mind, but it's sort of taking the BCDA on the road. And when I say that, I would love nothing more than to load up a van with students and take them out and show them how to read landscapes, how to study buildings, how to do that boots on the ground community historic preservation work, how we look at craftspeople and how we can use the craft to understand the landscape. So I very much envision it as us, loading up, riding through the rural areas of the South, looking at churches, cemeteries, schools, lodges, wherever we can, find an open door and teaching students that way. Because that's one of the things I used to always be amazed as a graduate student when I'd be in the car with my advisor, Dr. West, and he'd be pointing things out to me. And I'm always like, well, how did you know that? Because what it really came down to was that he saw it so much, he trained his eye. And so for me, I would love to be able to help students interested in this kind of work to sort of train their eye to recognize things on the landscape as they're out and about.
Well, that sounds fantastic. It sounds like a course that it's ready to happen.
I hope so.
A semester in the van with Dr. Momon. It resonates with me. That's certainly one of the ways that I caught the bug of this line of work from from professors and mentors who had been looking for a long time and just kind of helped me see what they were seeing. So it's maybe not a kind of a sophisticated or repeatable kind of pedagogy, but it's a really powerful kind of pedagogy, and I totally acknowledge that. And so I hope that the Sewanee students are tuned in enough to know that to take your classes, to be able to learn to do some of that. And it sounds like more profoundly in the communities around the university, rather as well as in the university itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and hopefully as our work takes us back and forth to Alabama, I hope we can cross paths as well. And you can do a little bit of landscape narration for me and my students.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love that.
Great. So I'm sorry, I'm just seeing a note from our great colleague in Montgomery, Alabama, Vincent Hall. The value of boots on the ground cannot be overstated. And I will validate that by saying the value of spending feet on the ground with Vincent and Georgette Norman and other folks a couple of weeks ago in Montgomery had a great impact on me and my students. And we're benefiting directly from the work of folks like Vincent and scholars like you, Dr. Momon. So with that, I think we're close to an hour, and so I think I will say thank you profoundly, and say how grateful I am that you took the time to spend with us. We really look forward to seeing what happens next with all of your work, blackcraftspeople.org, as well as your published work. And I hope that we stay in touch. And again, thanks so much for your time and for your work. It's really important and profound.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, good night, everyone. And thanks again to Dr. Tiffany Momon.
Thanks.